This week we were looking at chapters 10 through to 20, and I hope you've all managed to have a look at them. And even if you haven't, that maybe this evening will inspire you to go back and have another look or reread her or read her for the first time. So tonight, what I wanted to focus on in this preliminary introduction was I wanted to focus on the conversations that she has with Christ, because it's really in these sections that they really take off, I should say. So if you remember, the first time that Christ speaks to her is actually right on early in the book. It's actually immediately in chapter 1. And she's been having quite an interesting life, one could say, a very colourful life. And he says to her, "Why have you forsaken me?" Now, that single statement, just the one question, is very comparable to not only biblical conversion statements, but also within other mystic, a short, powerful conversion statement. If you remember, Paul on the road to Damascus hears from Jesus saying to him, "Why do you persecute me?" So it's very comparable then, that locution from Christ that turns someone around in their life. Then we hear in the next chapter, in chapter 5, the locutions, the conversations increasingly become more lengthy. And if you remember in that chapter, he gives her a lot of commands that are all different, very wide-ranging, and about what she's to eat, how she's to fast, what manner of ways in which she is to pray. And this begins then to open up her first visionary encounter with St. Anne, and then with St. Mary as well. But then we go on to the section that we've been looking at this evening, this chapters 10 to 20, and really they start to dominate her internal landscape. We don't have any real visions in this section, but we have lots of conversations. And I wanted us to just think a little bit about the nature of these conversations, because we're given quite a lot in a lot of different conversations in this section. First of all, one has to say, is she's really rather chatty with Jesus. She describes it in chapter 17 as a kind of a dalliance, an easy, leisured, like talking to your friend, or in fact, into your husband. And we know right from the beginning of this section, we have that whole kind of tussle really with her husband to be released from her conjugal rights. And you get the sense is that she wants this because she wants then to become the bride of Christ. And it says very beautifully in one of the sections, a husband says very beautifully, "May your body be as freely available to God as it has been to me." A very touching moment when actually that marital relationship on earth moves into a kind of marital relationship then with Christ. And so you have this easy conversation between Christ and her, as if you were like a husband and a wife. But there are other aspects to these conversations. So the aspect is which Margery is very much the mouthpiece for Jesus. So he will say to her, "I want you to go and see so-and-so and tell them so-and-so." So she's becoming like an angel, an emissary, a mouthpiece, whatever you want to say, or even you can think about it in prophetic terms. You think of Jeremiah and Amos and all of them. The Lord Christ says, if you do not. So there's all that sort of resonance behind it. And then thirdly, we have this sense in which she intercedes. So she helps people. She's a kind of intercessor for people to Christ, so the other way around. If you remember in chapter 12, she tells a monk that he has to amend his life, but then she spends a long time with that monk, helping him to reform his life so that then his relationship with Christ has been put back into the proper mode of intimacy that it had been lost through his life and through his sin. So very interesting. And then, of course, finally, the bit that really takes up quite a lot of her conversations is about her own spiritual journey. She asked Jesus a great deal about spiritual advice, and Jesus tells her, you know, this is why you may feel the presence of me sometimes, and this is why you may feel hidden, but this is how much I love you. This is how much I care for you. So there's a lot of reassurance going on from Jesus's side. And also there's a lot of sort of spiritual direction helping her to develop her walk with God. Now, because Margery spends quite so much time on this, I mean, if you look at somebody like Julian, she's certainly not talking about her spiritual life with Jesus at all. You know, Julian is very much about listening and hearing a revelation from Jesus about a new understanding of what God's love is like, using all the kind of language and imagery of scripture to give a deeper understanding. And Julian is so concerned about enabling that word to be given to other people. It's not for her. And Julian's very clear about that. And so Margery's very different. Margery feel that you're sitting in on a kind of talk with her confessor, or talk with her spiritual director, with Jesus acting as the kind of spiritual director. Now that's quite interesting if you think about it on one level, particularly from a post-Reformation sort of era, where we pray to Jesus, and it's very much, we have that sense of an intimate, close relationship, because that access was sort of really opened up during the whole theological rethinking of our human relationship with God through the Reformation. But this is pre-Reformation. This is very much the nature of the Catholic Church, which is still honoured and loved today. But the role of the priest is much more important in that. So when you go to confession, you speak to the priest, but the priest is the person who's sitting there in the role, in the nature of Christ. So you're speaking to Christ, but you're also speaking to Christ through the priest. So Margery has sort of, in this interesting world of hers, has sort of, in her conversations with Christ, she has moved a little beyond talking to her confessor or her spiritual guide, and she's very much talking to Christ himself in her understanding and in her visionary world. What's interesting is that if you look at some of the scholarship around the conversations that Margery has, there's quite a lot of negative, there's quite a lot of negative understanding of these conversations. Some people, I've seen them as insignificant and lacking in impact. And I think one person actually in their edition moved all the conversations to the back of the book because they weren't of any importance whatsoever. And they don't say anything revelatory. And so they're just, you know, they're just a kind of self-indulgent sort of thing that Margery does. So quite a negative approach to the conversations that Margery has with Christ. The other interesting thing is that, as we're saying, you know, Margery sounds very much like she's having a conversation with her spiritual director. So some scholars have actually said, well, maybe that's exactly what's going on, is that we're not hearing the voice of God. Actually, we're hearing the voice of the priest scribe to whom Julian is writing. And in trying to articulate her spiritual life, the priest voice, the priest writer, and that voice is being identified and sort of assimilated into a conversation being seen with Christ. Very interesting, and it raises enormous questions, I suppose, of, you know, authenticity of revelations, but also authenticity in text. How much of the voice of the priest is actually there, and how much is the priest simply recording? Now, one of the reasons that this is argued is because if you go to chapter, if you go to, where is it? Let me just look. Yeah, chapter 18. Then you'll see that the advice that Margery is given from William Southfield in Norwich is pretty similar to what Christ says to her in one of the conversations. So there's a kind of comparison there. You know, you're saying Christ says this, but actually there's this chap in Norwich who said pretty much exactly the same thing. The other thing that we can actually, the way we can approach this is instead of being slightly cynical, because I think that's quite a slightly cynical approach, is seeing how the priest scribe is trying to help Margery articulate something that is ineffable. She's trying to articulate something, an experience she has, a closeness that she has with Christ, which is difficult for her to put into language. And so what the scribe is doing is enabling her, giving the tools of spiritual, sorry, there we are, let someone else in, giving her the tools of discourse, of devotional discourse, to actually be able to speak about her own internal life. That's quite an interesting, I think, approach to think of it like that, because it then sort of moves us away from seeing these conversations as insignificant and, you know, of no value at all. But now we're moving into a world where someone is trying to articulate, to put into words something about their own spiritual development, their own spiritual doubts, their own spiritual sense of calling. And as we know from Margery, it's very radical, her sense of calling. And she's got lots of people who think that basically she's crazy. Sorry to use that, but that's basically how they sort of are approaching her. So she's getting lots of flack, lots of reason for giving up this way of life. And yet there's something within her that is driving her in a kind of vocation terms. And she needs to understand what this is. And that's why I think maybe all these conversations are a way of her articulating to us, articulating even maybe to herself, what is exactly going on. There's something quite sweet, I think, also about when you actually look at these conversations, is Margery sounds very vulnerable in them, very tentative in them. She needs lots of reassurance. And also you don't get the sense that when Christ is speaking, that there's this great magisterial figure. If you think of, let's think of Julian, when amazing chapter, I can't, is it chapter 10? I never remember them rightly. When Christ appears to Julian and says, I it am that thou lovest, I it am, and these constant I it am, says it about 10 times in this great sort of magisterial presence of Christ, which is awesome. That's not what we have here. We have a reassuring, kindly, fatherly figure who's sort of, yeah, it's all, I know you're feeling that, but I'm still there with you. And it's so very human in this interaction. And I wonder, for ourselves, whether Margery's attempt to articulate also speaks in our own attempts to articulate our own spiritual life, and maybe some of the guides who have helped us along the way understand what it is that we experience, what is our path, what is our walk with God, however unique that may look. So the uniqueness of Margery's conversations with Christ on one level can feel quite self-indulgent, but on another level might be just that that struggle with how do I walk with Christ in this kind of way that I've been called to be. I think the other thing that is helpful is thinking about these in context. So I've touched a little bit on Julian, obviously, but what does the context tell us as well? Well, it's really interesting because before the late 14th century, it seems that these kind of conversations were not a major part of devotional writing, particularly having Christ talking to you. It may be that you direct your prayers to Christ, that you are actually speaking to Christ yourself, or that someone is relaying words from Christ, but actually having this relayed within a devotional text is not really prevalent before this time. It's not really until the late 14th century, and it's specifically associated with women mystics of the time. So the very first person who I think we can identify as having something that's comparable to Julian is the German mystic Gertrude the Great, who died in 1302. And her revelation was a devotion. She revealed that kind of, established that devotion to the Sacred Heart with that stress on the familiarity of and warmth of Christ's love, how it's very familial. It's like a friend and a lover and a father, a husband, and encouraged the idea of sort of lengthy dialogue. So that's sort of where we can kind of locate that it really starts to take off. And then, of course, it is a really important feature of the greats at this time, who Margery certainly did honor and probably wish to be like. There's St. Bridget, and her dates are 1303 to 1373, a great visionary of the time, and St. Catherine of Siena, and her dates are 1347 to 80. And of course, on the male side, we have Henry Suso in 1295, to 1366. So all these people are writing just before Margery. And you'll have noticed that in one of the chapters, Margery wants to associate herself with the lovers of God. And she mentions reading or hearing read to her the texts of Bridget of Sweden and also of others who have these very important influence on her. So how much then is Margery following a convention of writing which expressed a person's understanding as if God is speaking, and how much were they actually revelations in themselves? It's difficult to say. It's difficult to answer that question, because unlike Julian, keep going back to Julian, but Julian is really interesting in how scrupulous she is in saying how things were given to her. She'll say it was, you know, bodily without ghostly, ghostly without bodily, informed in my mind. She has lots of different categories that she actually places her revelations in. So she's so careful about saying, well, this how it appeared to me. This was a dream. So all the demonic visions, if you want to call them that, she actually very clearly categorizes as dreams. Well, we don't get that in Margery at all. Instead, what we get from Margery is that she simply says, said in her mind. That's kind of it. That's all she sort of gives us in chapter 14. So either she doesn't know the full kind of the full understanding of the levels in which visions can be given, you know, she's just not aware, or she doesn't have the tools to actually articulate it, or she just possibly just doesn't have that knowledge of the devotional writing in the way to actually categorize what she's experiencing. It's interesting that it's interesting, though, that Margery, in the way she talks about her conversations with Christ, is that she is very clear in the way she approaches them and records them, is that to her, they are seen as directly being given by God. They're received at a time, at a moment when she is in inspiration. And you'll remember, looking through my notes here, because I've got the quote here somewhere, that she actually said that Christ says to her that the conversations as well as her tears are free gifts of God. So they're being seen in that sense of actually being a gift, a given, not something that she is imagining or that she is using in her own mind, or an internal conversation, that it is something that's given. So for Margery, they're seen as a kind of revelation. But it's really interesting, isn't it, that even Margery is full of doubts. So she goes to person after person. I think this section has to go to 4 different people, you know, to tell her story. Blimey, 4 different people to say, this is what, you know, I experienced, this is the, you know, and once again, she just keeps wanting that validation. Are they revelations? Are they not revelations? And every time that we have in this section, people are validating her, but she doesn't quite believe it. So poor love, she must have been really racked within her soul, you know. She's constantly doubting herself about it. So why are these significant for us? What can we get from them for us today? What is there here that is more than just a document of a remarkable late 14th century, early 15th century soul, and in their struggle to articulate their ineffable experience, their understanding the spiritual life? Well, I think what we have here is a wonderful and unguarded, it seems to me, and quite vulnerable articulation of words of what the spiritual life is like. Now, it may be this is Margery's experience, and it may not be our own, but it's the way in which she continually tries to put things into words, from what she lives, what she believes, what she experiences, and then tries to put it down on paper for us. And I think there's something really valuable about that for us, not just in that process, but also in seeing how she struggles to do that, and how she constantly needs going back to the beginning, telling it again, trying to understand it again. You know, it's not so much that she's obsessed, but that the repeating of it helps her to constantly understand her relationship, understand God better. And I think that has something that's quite beautiful about it, that sheer honesty before God. And also the sense that God is beautifully honest and tender towards us in our own spiritual life. It makes me wonder sometimes, you know, that we can put on our Sunday best for God. And we can say, well, actually, we don't really want to share our real lives with you, but we'll tell you what maybe you want to hear. And as a spiritual director myself, you sometimes are cautious that people don't tell you what they want you to hear, but absolutely get under the skin, and that honesty about our human natures, and that notion that actually that's what God wants to hear and wants to work with, and knows us better than we know ourselves. And so there's something beautiful, I think, about Margery in all her kind of chaos and her strange ways, and the way that she continues in the face of so much opposition. She holds true. She holds true. So there's my sort of musings about the conversations of Margery, but I'm sure I do hope you have an interesting time talking together, what you have made of them and what you make of her texts so far. Now, what I'm going to do is, once again, I'm going to screen share with you the questions. Okay.